I never thought much about neighbors until Damien moved in next door. Before him, the apartment complex was just a collection of strangers shuffling past each other in narrow hallways, keys jingling, doors clicking shut. We all existed in our separate boxes, careful not to look too long, not to intrude. I liked it that way. At 20, I had my life arranged just how I wanted it. College classes in the morning, shifts at the campus bookstore in the afternoon, quiet evenings with textbooks spread across my small kitchen table. Everything had its place. Everything made sense. Then Damien arrived with a pickup truck full of furniture that didn't quite fit through doorways, a toolbox that seemed to contain every implement known to man, and a laugh that carried through the thin walls whether I wanted to hear or not. 22, maybe 23, with the kind of easy confidence that made him knock on doors without hesitation, ask favors without apology. I watched him from my kitchen window that first week, hauling boxes up the stairs, pausing to chat with Mrs. Chun from 3B, helping the college girls on the second floor carry their groceries. He moved through the world like he belonged everywhere, like every space was his to claim. The tool belt came later. Or maybe I just started noticing it later. The leather worn soft from use, hammers and screwdrivers hanging from metal loops, the casual way he wore it low on his hips, even when he was just checking his mail. There was something about seeing him like that, prepared for any small crisis, ready to fix whatever might break. Our first real conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon when my kitchen sink decided to stage a rebellion. Water backing up, refusing to drain, the disposal making sounds like it was dying a slow, mechanical death. I stood there staring at it, wrench in hand, wondering if YouTube tutorials could save me from calling a plumber I couldn't afford. That's when the knocking started. I opened the door to find Damien leaning against the frame, that toolbox in his hand, grinning like he'd been expecting this moment. He said he heard the grinding from next door, asked if I needed help. His eyes were darker than I'd realized, brown with flecks of green that caught the hallway light. I stepped aside to let him in, watched him assess my small kitchen with the kind of focus I usually reserve for exam prep. He rolled up his sleeves, knelt beside the sink, started taking things apart with the efficiency of someone who understood how the world worked on a mechanical level. I hovered nearby, feeling useless, offering to hand him tools he didn't need. He worked quietly, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or frustration that seemed to come from deep in his chest. There was something mesmerizing about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing, whose hands moved with certainty while mine always seemed to be searching for the right place to rest. When he finally got the water running clear again, he sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a dish towel I'd given him. That's when he looked up at me with that expression I would come to know so well. Half accomplishment, half mischief, like he'd just solved the puzzle that had been bothering him for days. He said my garbage disposal just needed to be reset, that these old apartments were temperamental but not broken. His voice had this quality to it, warm and slightly rough around the edges, like he'd spent years talking over power tools and construction noise. I thanked him, offered him coffee, water, anything I could think of to keep him there a few minutes longer. But he was already packing up his tools, standing to leave, and I felt this strange disappointment settle in my chest. That's when he paused in my doorway, one hand braced against the frame, and asked the question that would change everything. He said he needed soap. Not dish soap, not laundry detergent, just regular soap for a shower. He'd moved in so fast he'd forgotten to stock the basics, and the corner store was closed for inventory. He wondered if I might have some he could borrow. The request was so simple, so ordinary, that I almost laughed. Of course I had soap. I had 3 different bottles in my shower, backup bars under the sink, the kind of excessive preparation that came from growing up without enough of everything. I told him sure, pointed toward the bathroom, said he could grab whatever he needed. I expected him to take a bottle and leave, maybe promise to replace it later, the kind of neighbor transaction that happens 1,000 times in apartment buildings across the world. Instead, I heard the shower turn on. I stood in my kitchen, frozen between the sink he just fixed and the bathroom, where water was now running, trying to process what was happening. Had I misunderstood? Had he misunderstood? The sound of water hitting tile filled my small apartment, intimate and impossible to ignore. Minutes passed. The shower kept running. I found myself holding my breath, listening for some signal of what was expected of me, what was normal in a situation that felt anything but normal. Then his voice carried over the sound of water, casual as anything, asking if I knew where the soap had gone. He couldn't find it in all the steam. Could I help him out? My heart started doing something erratic against my ribs. I stood there in my own apartment, in my own life, and suddenly nothing felt familiar. The careful boundaries I'd built around myself seemed to shimmer and blur like heat waves rising off summer pavement. I walked toward the bathroom on unsteady legs, each step feeling like a choice I wasn't sure I was ready to make. The door was open, steam spilling into the hallway, and through the frosted glass of the shower door, I could see his silhouette, water cascading over broad shoulders, head tilted back. I reached for the handle of the shower door, my fingers trembling slightly, and slid it open just enough to pass him the bottle of soap I'd grabbed from the counter. That's when he looked at me, really looked at me, water streaming down his face, that same half-mischievous expression, but softer now, more vulnerable. He took the soap from my hand, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he stepped aside, just slightly, just enough to make room, and asked if I wanted to join him. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with steam and possibility and the weight of every careful boundary I'd ever drawn around my life. I could see my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wide-eyed and uncertain, standing at the threshold of something I'd never allowed myself to want. The shower was still running. Damien was still waiting, patient and present, and offering me something I didn't have words for yet. And in that moment, with water vapor swirling around us like fog, I realized that all my careful planning, all my neat arrangements and predictable routines had been leading me here, to this choice, this doorway, this man who fixed things and asked for soap and looked at me like I was worth the risk of everything changing. I said yes. Not with words, but with the way I stepped forward, the way I let the bathroom door close behind me, the way I accepted his hand when he offered it to steady me as I stepped over the edge of the tub. The water was warmer than I expected, and for a moment we just stood there, two bodies sharing a space meant for one, steam rising around us like we were disappearing into something new. He handed me the soap back with that same easy smile, like this was just another problem he'd solve, another small repair in the endless maintenance of daily life. But his eyes stayed on mine longer than they needed to, and I understood that this moment was both ordinary and extraordinary, both simple and complicated beyond anything I'd ever navigated. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of learning that Damien Martinez was nothing like the careful, predictable life I'd built for myself, and everything I hadn't known I was missing. Where I kept my apartment neat to the point of obsession, Damien seemed to exist in a constant state of controlled chaos. His place next door overflowed with half-finished projects, tools scattered across every surface, books stacked in corners because he'd run out of shelf space. But somehow it all made sense when he moved through it, like the disorder was just another language he spoke fluently. He was studying engineering at the same college where I took my literature and psychology classes, but while I buried myself in theory and analysis, Damien learned by taking things apart and putting them back together. His hands were always slightly stained with something, grease, paint, wood stain, evidence of a life spent making and fixing and building. I started noticing him everywhere on campus after that afternoon in my shower. In the library, sprawled across a table with technical manuals and graph paper, dark hair falling into his eyes as he sketched mechanical drawings. At the coffee shop between classes, arguing good-naturedly with other engineering students about load-bearing calculations and structural integrity. Walking across the quad with that same easy confidence, tool belt replaced by a backpack that looked like it had survived several minor explosions. But it was in the evenings, in the quiet space between our apartment doors, that I really began to understand who he was. He had this way of showing up just when something in my life needed attention. A loose cabinet handle that had been bothering me for months. A window that stuck every time I tried to open it. A desk lamp that flickered whenever I moved it. Small things, the kind of minor irritations that most people learn to live with, but that Damien seemed to notice and want to fix. He never asked permission. He'd knock on my door with some excuse about needing to borrow salt or return a book, then spot whatever was broken and immediately start examining it with those careful, competent hands. Within minutes, he'd have his tools out, working with the kind of focused concentration that made everything else fade into background noise. I learned to make coffee when I heard his knock, learned to clear space on my small kitchen table for the parts he'd inevitably spread out as he worked, learned to sit quietly nearby, ostensibly reading or studying, but really just watching the way he approached problems, methodically, patiently, like every broken thing was a puzzle waiting to be solved rather than a frustration to endure. He talked while he worked, telling me stories about growing up in a house where something was always breaking down, where fixing things yourself wasn't a choice, but a necessity. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a nurse who worked double shifts, and Damien had learned early that if something needed doing, you figured out how to do it yourself. There is something comforting about listening to him, about the steady rhythm of his voice mixing with the sounds of whatever repair he was making. My apartment had never felt so lived in, so warm. The careful silence I'd cultivated suddenly seemed less like peace and more like emptiness. But it was the way he looked at me that really changed everything. When he thought I wasn't paying attention, when I was supposedly absorbed in a textbook or staring out the window, I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decode. Not the casual friendliness of a neighbor, not the distracted politeness of a classmate. Something deeper, more intentional. His eyes would linger on my hands when I passed him coffee, on my mouth when I laughed at something he said, on the curve of my neck when I bent over my books. The attention felt like a physical thing, warm and weight-bearing, like he was taking careful measurements of something he planned to build. And I found myself responding in ways I'd never allowed before, leaning closer when he explained how something worked, letting my fingers brush his when I handed him tools, standing in doorways longer than necessary, just to extend whatever excuse had brought us together. The shower had been an invitation, but this was something else. This was courtship, slow and careful and utterly deliberate. Damien was teaching me that desire didn't have to be urgent or desperate, that it could be patient, methodical, built piece by piece like any other worthwhile construction project. He was teaching me that some things were worth taking time to get right. And I was learning that maybe, after 20 years of keeping my life small and manageable and safe, I was ready for something larger. Something that might require tools I didn't own yet, skills I'd never developed, a kind of courage I was still learning to trust. Something that might break me apart completely before it taught me how to build myself back into someone new. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. After the shower, after those weeks of careful repairs and lingering coffee conversations, something fundamental changed in the space between us. What had been unspoken became a current running just beneath the surface of every interaction, invisible but undeniably present. Damien stopped pretending he needed excuses to come over. He'd knock on my door in the evenings with nothing broken to fix, no tools in his hands, just that easy smile and a question about whether I'd eaten dinner yet. I'd find myself saying no even when I had, just to watch him move through my kitchen with the same confidence he brought to everything else, opening cabinets like he'd memorized their contents, seasoning food with the instinctive knowledge of someone who'd learned to cook by necessity rather than instruction. He'd stand too close while washing dishes, his shoulder brushing mine as we maneuvered around my small sink. His hand would linger on my back when he reached past me for a towel, just long enough for me to register the warmth of his palm through my shirt, the deliberate nature of the touch. I started leaving my bathroom door open when I showered. Not quite invitation, but not quite accident either. The sound of running water had become our shared language, a reminder of that first afternoon when everything changed. Sometimes I'd hear him moving around his apartment next door, and I'd wonder if he was listening too, if he was remembering the way steam had risen around us like we were the only two people left in the world. One evening he sprawled across my couch like he belonged there, legs stretched out, one arm draped along the back cushions. I was sitting at the other end, supposedly reading for my modern American literature class, but really just watching the way the lamplight caught the angles of his face when he thought I wasn't looking. He was telling me about a project he was working on for his structural engineering course, something about load distribution and material stress, his hands moving as he talked, sketching invisible diagrams in the air. But his voice kept getting softer, more intimate, like he was sharing secrets instead of technical specifications. Then he stopped mid-sentence, caught me staring, and that familiar half-smile spread across his face. The one that said he knew exactly what he was doing, exactly what effect he was having on me. He asked if I was actually reading or just pretending to read while I watched him. His voice had dropped to that lower register I'd started recognizing, the one that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. I closed the book, set it aside, admitted I'd lost track of the page 10 minutes ago. He laughed, but not the easy, casual laugh I'd grown used to. This one was quieter, more knowing. He shifted on the couch, suddenly closer, his knee brushing against mine. Asked what I was thinking about instead of Hemingway and Lost Generations. The question hung between us, heavy with the weight of everything we'd been dancing around for weeks. I could have deflected, made some joke about being distracted by his engineering talk, kept us safely in the territory of friendly neighbors who occasionally shared meals and helped each other with household repairs. That would have been the Seth from 2 months ago, the one who kept his life neat and predictable and carefully contained. Instead, I told him the truth. That I was thinking about the afternoon he'd asked for soap, about the way he'd looked at me through the steam, about how nothing had felt quite real since then. That I was thinking about his hands when he fixed things, about the way he said my name when he was concentrating, about how my apartment felt empty now whenever he wasn't in it. The confession spilled out of me before I could stop it. Months of careful observation and growing want finally finding words. When I finished, the silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Damien reached over and took the book from my hands, set it on the coffee table with deliberate care. Then he turned back to me, his expression serious now, all trace of that teasing smile gone. He said he'd been hoping I'd noticed that every repair, every borrowed ingredient, every evening spent on my couch had been his way of circling closer, testing the boundaries of what was possible between us. He said he'd been finding excuses to knock on my door since his first week here, that fixing my sink had just been the first legitimate reason to stay longer than a few minutes. He told me he'd never met anyone who watched him work the way I did, with that kind of focused attention that made him feel like every small task was somehow important, worth doing well. That my quiet presence had become the thing he looked forward to most about coming home from classes, from long days in the engineering lab where everything was theoretical and nothing felt real. He said he'd been waiting for me to catch on, to understand that this wasn't just neighborly helpfulness or casual friendship, that it was courtship deliberate and patient and utterly sincere. The word hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or leave unfinished. Courtship, old-fashioned, intentional, the kind of slow building that happened when someone decided you were worth the time it took to do things right. I reached for his hand, felt the calluses on his palm from years of working with tools, the warmth of his fingers as they closed around mine. This was my answer, clearer than any words I could have chosen. The space between us disappeared as he leaned closer, his free hand coming up to trace the line of my jaw with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. His touch was gentle but certain, like he'd been planning this moment for weeks. When he kissed me, it wasn't urgent or desperate. It was deliberate, thorough, the kind of kiss that said we had all the time in the world to figure out what came next. After the kiss, everything became deliberate, not rushed, not frantic, but intentional in a way that made every moment feel weighted with significance. Damien didn't leave that night, didn't retreat to the safety of separate apartments and the pretense that nothing had changed. Instead, he stayed on my couch, his hand still in mine, and we talked until the sky outside my windows shifted from black to deep blue to the pale gold of early morning. We talked about things I'd never told anyone, about growing up careful, about learning early that the world felt safer when you kept your wants small and your expectations smaller, about the loneliness that had become so familiar I'd stopped recognizing it as loneliness at all, mistaking it instead for independence, for strength. He told me about moving through the world with confidence because he'd never been taught he shouldn't, about growing up in a house where problems were meant to be solved and broken things were meant to be fixed. About how meeting me had been the first time he'd encountered something he wanted to approach slowly, carefully, like I might break if he moved too fast. When the sun finally rose, casting long rectangles of light across my small living room, he kissed me again before he left. Not goodbye, but see you soon, a promise wrapped in the press of his lips against mine. From then on, my days reorganized themselves around him. He'd appear in my doorway most evenings, sometimes with his toolbox, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but that easy smile that had become as essential to me as coffee in the morning. My apartment, which had always felt perfectly sized for one careful person, somehow expanded to accommodate two. I learned the rhythm of his presence. The way he hummed unconsciously while he worked, always the same half-remembered melody that seemed to loop endlessly in his head. The way he moved through space like he was dancing with it, efficient but never hurried. The way he looked at broken things with curiosity rather than frustration, like every malfunction was just a puzzle waiting to be understood. He fixed my kitchen faucet, which had been dripping for months, tightened the loose handle on my bedroom door, rehung a picture frame that had been sitting crooked since I'd moved in, too high for me to reach properly. Small things, but each repair felt like an act of care, like he was slowly making my world more solid, more reliable. I started cooking for two without asking if he'd be staying for dinner. Started buying the kind of coffee he preferred, the dark roast that tasted like earth and smoke. Started leaving space for him on my couch, arranging the pillows so there was room for both of us to sprawl comfortably. But it was the way he looked at me that really changed everything. When I was reading, when I was cooking, when I was just existing in the ordinary moments of daily life, I'd catch him watching me with an expression I was still learning to decode. Like he was memorizing something. Like he was solving the most important problem he'd ever encountered. He'd lean against kitchen counters while I made dinner, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, far enough that I had to be intentional about closing the space between us. He'd brush past me in hallways that were wide enough for two people, his hand trailing across my back like he needed to confirm I was real. The shower became our unspoken boundary. We'd reference it obliquely, in the way he'd mention needing to clean up after a particularly messy repair, in the way I'd offer him soap with a smile that held too much meaning. But we didn't cross that threshold again, not yet. It hung between us like a promise, like the memory of something we'd return to when we were ready for whatever came next. Instead, we found other forms of intimacy. His hand on my shoulder when he leaned over to see what I was reading. My fingers trailing through his hair when he'd sprawl across my lap, exhausted after a long day of classes and lab work. The way we'd fall asleep on my couch together, his arm around me, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I was changing too, in ways I hadn't expected. The careful boundaries I'd built around my life, the schedules, the routines, the predictable patterns that had made me feel safe, started to feel less necessary. I found myself saying yes to things I would have declined before. Staying up later, sleeping in when I could, letting dishes sit in the sink because spending time with Damien felt more important than maintaining perfect order. My friends at school started commenting on the difference. They said I seemed lighter somehow, more present, that I laughed more easily, spoke up more often in class discussions, that I looked like someone who was sleeping better, eating better, living better. I didn't tell them about Damien. Not yet. This thing between us still felt too new, too precious, too much like something that might disappear if I examined it too closely or shared it before it was ready. But I carried the weight of it with me everywhere, the knowledge that someone was choosing me, day after day, repair by repair, kiss by careful kiss. Someone was building something with me, something that might last, something worth taking the time to get right. And for the first time in my life, I was learning to trust that maybe, just maybe, I was worth that kind of patient construction. The revelation came on a Thursday night in late October, when the air had turned crisp enough to make me think about closing windows and pulling extra blankets from storage. Damien had been working on my bathroom cabinet for the better part of an hour, tightening hinges that had started to sag, adjusting the door so it would close properly instead of hanging slightly askew. I sat on the edge of my bed, supposedly grading papers for the tutoring work I did to supplement my bookstore income, but really just watching the careful precision of his movements in the mirror. He'd been quieter than usual that evening, more focused on his work, less inclined toward the easy conversation that had become our evening ritual. There was something different in the set of his shoulders, a tension I hadn't seen before, like he was working up the courage for something. When he finally set down his screwdriver and tested the cabinet door one last time, I expected him to pack up his tools and migrate to the kitchen for the dinner I'd been keeping warm. Instead, he sat back on his heels and looked at me through the mirror, his reflection catching mine in a way that made the moment feel suspended, crystalline. He said he had something to tell me. His voice was different, more serious than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the easy confidence that usually carried him through conversations. I set aside the papers I'd been pretending to read, turned to face him directly instead of through the safety of reflected glass. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, filled with the weight of whatever he was about to say. He told me he'd been thinking about that first afternoon, about the shower and the soap and the way everything had started between us. About how I'd asked him if he'd really just come over for soap, like I'd suspected all along that there was more to it. I remembered the question, remembered the way it had felt to finally voice what I'd been wondering for weeks. But I waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. He stood up, moved to lean against the bathroom door frame, and I recognized the pose from dozens of other conversations. But this time his usual ease was replaced by something more vulnerable, more exposed. He said he needed me to understand that it hadn't been an accident. Not the shower, not the visits, not any of it. That from the first week he'd moved in, he'd been finding reasons to knock on my door, excuses to stay longer than necessary, ways to weave himself into my carefully ordered life. The admission hung between us, and I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that went deeper than surprise. Part of me had known, had suspected that the broken sink and the borrowed soap and all the small repairs that followed had been pretense as much as genuine need. He said he'd noticed me before I'd noticed him, had seen me coming and going from my apartment, always alone, always moving with the kind of careful purpose that suggested someone who'd learned to rely only on themselves. That something about that self-containment had drawn him, made him want to find a way past the boundaries I'd built. He told me he'd been hoping I'd catch on, that I'd understand what he was really asking for when he showed up with his toolbox and that easy smile. But that as the weeks passed, as we fell into the rhythm of shared dinners and quiet evenings, he'd started to worry that maybe I thought it really was just neighborly kindness, casual friendship, two people who happened to live next door to each other. His voice got quieter as he continued, more uncertain. He said he'd been finding excuses to be close to me since the day he'd heard me struggling with that garbage disposal, that every repair had been his way of earning time in my space, my attention, my trust, that he'd been circling closer and closer, waiting for some sign that I wanted him there for reasons that had nothing to do with broken cabinet doors or leaky faucets. The honesty in his words hit me like a physical thing, settling somewhere deep in my chest where it felt both surprising and inevitable. I thought about all those evenings, all those careful conversations, all the ways he'd made himself essential to the rhythm of my days. How what I'd taken for coincidence had actually been strategy, patient and deliberate, and utterly focused on me. I stood up from the bed, crossed the small space between us until I was close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he was holding himself still like he was afraid of my reaction. I told him I'd known. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way I could have articulated before this moment, but some part of me had understood that this was courtship, that he was choosing me with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else he built or repaired. I told him I'd been hoping for exactly what he was offering, that I'd been watching him work and wishing he'd find more things to fix, more reasons to stay, that my life had felt incomplete in ways I hadn't recognized until he'd started filling the spaces I didn't know were empty. His face changed as I spoke, relief and something deeper replacing the careful uncertainty. When I reached for his hand, his fingers closed around mine with the same deliberate care he'd shown me from the beginning. The truth was finally spoken between us, clear and unambiguous. He wanted me. I wanted him. Everything else had been preparation for this moment, this acknowledgement, this choice to stop pretending we were anything other than two people who'd found something worth building together. And standing there in my small bathroom, surrounded by the evidence of all his patient repairs, I understood that we were about to begin the most important construction project either of us had ever undertaken. The confession should have made everything easier, but instead it left me suspended between wanting and uncertainty, like standing at the edge of something vast with no clear view of the other side. Damien was still holding my hand, his thumb tracing small circles across my knuckles, but I could see something shifting in his expression. The relief of finally speaking the truth was giving way to another kind of vulnerability, deeper and more immediate. He said my name quietly, like he was testing how it sounded in this new space we'd created between us. Then he asked the question I'd been both hoping for and dreading since that first afternoon in my shower. He asked if I wanted this. Not the friendship, not the companionship, not the easy rhythm of shared meals and evening conversations. This, what we'd been building toward through weeks of careful circling, of patient courtship, of hands that lingered and eyes that said more than our careful words ever had. The question hung in the small space between us, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd ever made to keep my life safe, predictable, contained. Every time I'd chosen certainty over possibility, routine over risk, the familiar comfort of being alone over the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone close enough to matter. I looked at him standing in my bathroom doorframe, this man who'd spent months learning the geography of my apartment, memorizing which cabinet doors stuck and which faucets dripped and exactly how much space I needed to move comfortably through my own life. Who'd approach me like I was something worth studying, worth understanding, worth the patient work of earning trust. The fear was there, immediate and real. Fear of what it would mean to say yes, to cross whatever line we'd been walking for weeks. Fear of losing the careful control I'd built around my heart, of letting someone in close enough to rearrange everything I thought I knew about myself. But stronger than the fear was something else. A recognition that felt like coming home, like finally understanding what I'd been preparing for without knowing it. Every evening he'd spent on my couch, every repair he'd made, every moment of quiet companionship had been leading here, to this choice, to this moment when I could finally stop pretending I didn't want exactly what he was offering. I told him yes. The word came out smaller than I'd intended, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough that I saw his shoulders relax, saw something in his eyes shift from uncertainty to something that looked like relief mixed with hunger. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of soap on his skin, the mixture of clean cotton and something distinctly him that I'd been noticing for weeks without letting myself acknowledge what that noticing meant. His free hand came up to cup my face, his palm warm against my cheek, his thumb brushing across my bottom lip with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. He asked if I was sure, his voice low and serious, like he understood the magnitude of what I was agreeing to. I nodded, then leaned into his touch, letting myself close the last bit of distance between us. When he kissed me this time, it wasn't the careful, exploratory kiss from weeks before. This was deeper, more certain, filled with all the want we'd been holding back. I felt myself responding in ways I'd never allowed before, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of his body against mine. The careful boundaries I'd maintained around my own desire began to dissolve, replaced by something more urgent, more honest. He backed me against the bathroom wall, his body pressing against mine, and I could feel his heartbeat through his chest, fast and strong and real. His hands were in my hair, on my face, tracing the line of my neck like he was mapping something precious. The intensity of it overwhelmed me. Not just the physical sensation, but the emotional weight of finally letting someone this close, of allowing myself to want something this much. 20 years of careful self-protection were crumbling, and I wasn't sure if what I was feeling was liberation or terror. He must have sensed my hesitation because he pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing as unsteady as my own. He asked if I was okay, if this was too much, if I needed him to slow down. The gentleness in his voice, the way he was still taking care of me even in the middle of his own obvious want, made something crack open in my chest. I realized that this was what I'd been afraid of all along. Not the physical intimacy, but the tenderness. The way he was looking at me like I was something worth cherishing, worth protecting, worth the careful attention he gave to everything he truly cared about. I told him I was scared. The admission surprised me with its honesty, but it felt necessary, like something that needed to be spoken before we could go any further. He said he was scared too, that he'd never wanted anything the way he wanted me. That the thought of moving too fast, of pushing too hard, of somehow breaking what we'd built together kept him awake at night. But he said he was more afraid of not trying, of letting fear keep us from finding out what we could be together. He said he'd been patient for months, that he could be patient for as long as I needed, but that he hoped I wouldn't ask him to pretend he didn't want me. His honesty deserved the same in return. I told him I didn't want him to pretend anything, that I was tired of being careful, tired of keeping my wants small, tired of living like I was afraid of my own life. I told him I wanted him to show me what came next. What came next was silence, but not the empty kind I'd grown accustomed to in my carefully ordered life. This was the silence of two people learning each other's rhythms, of breath steadying against breath, of hands that had finally found their proper place. Damien led me to my own bedroom like he'd been there 100 times before, though he'd only ever lingered in the doorway while working on that cabinet. But he moved through the space with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else, like he'd been mapping the route for weeks and was finally ready to travel it. We undressed each other slowly, deliberately, with the same patient attention he'd shown to every repair he'd ever made in my apartment. His hands traced the lines of my shoulders, my chest, my waist, like he was memorizing the construction of something he planned to spend a long time maintaining. When he kissed me again, I understood that this wasn't just desire, though desire was certainly part of it. This was completion, the final piece of something we'd been building together since that first afternoon when he'd asked for soap and I'd been brave enough to say yes. But it was later, after everything had shifted into the new configuration we'd both been waiting for, that the real resolution came. When the urgency had settled into something quieter, more sustainable, and we lay in my bed with the late evening light filtering through curtains I'd forgotten to close. He said he needed another shower. The words were casual enough, but there was something in the way he said them, some echo of that first afternoon, that made me understand he was offering me a choice. A chance to complete the circle we'd started months ago, to return to the place where everything had begun, but as different people now, people who'd finally stopped pretending they didn't want exactly what they had. I said I could probably find some soap for him. We walked to the bathroom together, no longer nervous, no longer uncertain about what we were asking of each other. He turned on the water while I gathered towels, and when the steam began to rise, I understood that this was both an ending and a beginning. The end of months of careful circling, patient courtship, and questions we'd been afraid to ask directly. The beginning of something we'd have to build day by day, repair by repair, choice by careful choice. This time when he stepped into the shower, there was no pretense about borrowing soap, no careful negotiation of boundaries or uncertain invitations. He simply held out his hand, and I took it, and we stepped into the steam together like we'd been doing it for years. The water was the same temperature it had been that first afternoon, warm enough to fog the mirror, hot enough to make the small bathroom feel like we were wrapped in clouds. But everything else was different now. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by something more solid, more intentional. He washed my hair with the same careful attention he'd shown to every broken thing he'd ever fixed, his fingers working through the tangles like he was solving a problem he genuinely wanted to understand. I traced the lines of water running down his chest, followed the paths they made across skin I was finally allowed to touch without apology or explanation. We stayed in that shower longer than was practical, longer than the hot water should have lasted, like we were trying to make up for all the showers we'd taken separately, all the times we'd stood in our own bathrooms thinking about each other through the thin wall between our apartments. When we finally stepped out, wrapping each other in towels that smelled like the lavender detergent I'd been using for years, I caught sight of us in the mirror. We looked different than I'd expected. Not like two separate people who'd happened to end up in the same space, but like something that belonged together, something that made sense in a way I'd never quite achieved on my own. He said he should probably go back to his apartment. Let me get some sleep, return to the rhythm of separate lives that we'd maintained even as we'd grown closer. But his voice lacked conviction, like he was offering me an out he didn't actually want me to take. I told him he could stay if he wanted to, that I'd gotten used to falling asleep with him on my couch, that my bed was big enough for two people who didn't mind sharing space. He smiled then, that same easy smile that at first made me understand I was in trouble, but softer now, more certain. He said he'd been hoping I'd ask. We fell asleep with his arm around me, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. The same sounds I've been falling asleep to for months, but they felt different now. Less like the background noise of a life lived alone, more like the soundtrack to something I was finally ready to call home. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of him making coffee in my kitchen, humming that same half-remembered melody he'd been carrying since the first day I'd met him. And I understood that this was what I'd been building toward without knowing it. Not just the shower, not just the choice to let someone close, but this. The quiet, domestic intimacy of someone who belonged in my space, who'd learned the geography of my life and decided it was worth staying for. Someone who'd fixed all the small broken things in my apartment, and somehow, in the process, had helped me understand that I'd never been broken at all. Just waiting for the right person to show me what I was capable of building when I stopped being afraid of letting someone help.